Good afternoon. We're not quite, I think, well, I'm being given the green light in a moment, but I think we're just gonna wait for a few more people to come on board. So if you just bear with us a minute or so. Right, I think I've been given the green light, which is great. So just a quick hello from me. I'm James Callender, one of the managing directors at Fresh Minds, and I will be your host this afternoon of our ESG webinar. Thank you so much for signing up and joining us on what is a fairly miserable, certainly in London, afternoon, and hopefully that the rain and bad weather will be lightened by or enlightened by an hour with Melissa. The format today will be a little different from previous webinars. Obviously, we had our diversity one a couple of weeks ago. This one's a little bit more of a kind of fireside chat. I was going to say Frost Nixon, but it's probably not quite the right pitch. But more really a chance to kind of ask Melissa some questions, given her some depth of experience. So I'll probably speak with her for the first half or so, and then after that we'll kind of move into questions from our audience. And our audience is quite a range in terms of both level and function and indeed industry. But I suppose there are three kind of groupings I'd say is we've got a few consulting firms who are kind of obviously interested in either delivering ESG sort of advice to clients, and we have some corporates, small and large, who are looking at how to improve their business around the world of ESG. And we also have some investment firms, so people who I guess are either in that world or maybe looking to move into that direction. So quite a mix, and we'll try to answer all the various questions that sort of come through. But it moves me now to maybe introduce Melissa, or Dr. Melissa Barrett, who was until last year the MD, head of sort of consumer and sustainability at Accenture, and has been doing ESG for a lot longer than people like BlackRock thought it was a sensible asset class to invest in. And she will be kind of giving us a bit of a briefer in terms of, what, first of all, to start with just a bit of an introduction to her and a bit of introduction to ESG, and then we'll move into my questions. So bear with us, relax, grab a cup of tea, and Melissa, very warm welcome to Fresh Minds webinar.
Thank you very much, James. Bit of intro and background to me, and thanks, James, for the lovely introduction. I've spent maybe 20 years in my professional life in sustainability and ESG, if we want to call it that. Originally with an environmental sciences background, and working with a number of R&D organisations in Australia and in the UK. And about 16 or 17 years in consulting, firstly with Arthur D. Little, and then latterly spent 10 years with Accenture. The last 5, I guess, mostly focused in consumer industries. So I guess early stage in some heavier industry work, and then more latterly within the consumer goods value chain specifically. But now I'm working independently and really engaged, and I guess also really excited, I guess, by the dynamism and what's happening in the market at the moment around this topic more broadly. And so it's great to be able to be with a number of people here, and I look forward to the questions later as well, because I think we all have a different perspective on what's happening, and reading the market, I think, is part of that at the moment. Perhaps useful to sort of give a few thoughts, James, first on what I'm hearing and seeing. Is that helpful?
That'd be really good. Yeah, it'd be good, just a bit of a sort of your take on where we're at and what's changed, maybe.
Yeah, for sure. I guess the headline here was ESG in particular, and I guess ESG is a term that's been used for a very long time. In my perspective and what I'm seeing, ESG is perhaps the language of investors. It's the language of data providers, standard setters. It's the language of their stakeholders in particular. And perhaps increasingly, it's becoming the language of the corporate functions who serve these audiences as well. So the ESG language has ramped up a lot, and you are seeing the corporate entities using these terms where it has been the domain of investors in the past. Whereas I've sort of lived in more of a space where sustainability has been the language of the day. It's the language of the business operators, of the value chains, of suppliers, of customers, perhaps, and their ecosystem of stakeholders. So I think it's interesting. The rise of ESG over the last few years is probably a factor of the rise of the finance sector, the investment sector interest in this area, and this cascade more broadly as well. So it's that sort of a journey I think we've had a little bit. I remember 15, 16 years ago doing ESG due diligence for private equity firms. And so it's not new, and I'm sure there was a lot more happening before that as well. Mostly, I guess, at that stage from a compliance standpoint, from a license to operate standpoint. What I think is happening now, though, and certainly has risen over the last 10, 15 years in particular, is that it's not just about a license to operate, tick the boxes, but companies are finding a way for it to become their license to grow, and this necessity, if you like, around understanding your footprint, your value chain across the environmental, the social, and the governance aspects more broadly. And for many corporations as well, looking at a way to use this as a way to in their product portfolios, their services, and I guess now very much around developing new business models to be able to serve the markets in this area as well. So I think this journey around the terminology is useful to have in mind, but it's also one of these things that I think ESG is actually quite helpful right now, because it's increasing prominence of social aspects, it's increasing the prominence of governance aspects that were perhaps sort of are taking second seat for a little while. So I think that's where I'm seeing the journey. Yeah. I think the big watch outs, and James, we've talked about this a little bit, is how much of this is the financial sector playing lip service, how much of this is the corporates getting into a place of jumping on the bandwagon and at risk of greenwashing. So it'd be interesting to get others' take on that in particular, but also the sense of what's happening now is part of a journey, I think, as well.
Yeah. And we'll definitely pick up on greenwashing a little bit later on. But I mean, did you detect, if there's in the last 20 years, a sort of tipping point of when it did go from kind of, as we sort of said in our title, from fringe to mainstream? What was the kind of, when did it go from kind of sustainability team to like something that was discussed at board level? For a corporate perspective? I
think there's some different stages. Certainly the last year, off the back of COVID, there's been perhaps a crazy change in many cases, in particular around the pull on professional services, on data, on even consulting services more broadly, as well as there's quite a pivot point around new business models that's been accelerated a bit by COVID as well. So I think there is something in the last 6 to 9 months that we've really seen. Before that, though, we had Greta Thunberg, we had a lot of environmental or climate activism. Before that, perhaps David Attenborough with plastics. I think there's these topics that have stimulated the consumer and citizen to be more aware, to be asking bigger questions, and to be, I guess, holding brands to account more. So I think that's probably a 2 to 3 year journey in many cases on this sort of rush, if you like, But companies have been in this place for a long time, trying to look at how they manage their impact and how they make business value and commercial value from it as well. Whether that's the Marks and Spencer's Plan A, or whether that's Unilever's Sustainable Living Plan, or others, there's been a lot of this aspect of how do we look to build good businesses with a strong sustainability impact.
And let's focus a bit on the corporate. So it is, I looked actually on LinkedIn earlier today. There are 1,342 ESG jobs in the UK as of this afternoon. Fairly interesting stat. That's quite a lot, I would say, in terms of our trade. In terms of, I suppose, it's a bit like having a big data team or an innovation team within a corporate. It's something that the CEO has found out about and is keen to kind of bring in to drive, improvement or organic growth in a new way. Obviously, ESG is probably joining that. I wouldn't say bandwagon, but it sounds cynical, but that kind of type of kind of interest. And I suppose, what's your thinking in terms of just the capability improvement that's required? So you then have a team in that area, and you can have some big thinkers who have a kind of, I think you've got a plant physiology PhD, but people with an understanding of sustainability. But then in terms of actually driving that across a huge swathe of the business, from finance to sourcing, what are the capabilities you think, if you look ahead the next 5-10 years, what will be the capability within that team going forward to make sure that actually it's delivered ultimately?
Yeah, and each organization will be different. They'll have their own legacy, origination of where they have these capabilities within the business. And so I think for many, or for every organization, it's about understanding what assets, capabilities, resources, knowledge they have already embedded within their organization. They will know their organization best, and they will also know their industry best, where they're placed in the industry. Mindful, though, that a lot of sustainability value, if you like, or ESG value, is opened up when functions work together. It's opened up when you're looking at partnerships. It's opened up when you're looking at different business models or different ways to do things. And so often the human capabilities, I think, will be needed and are needed, are often around how to join these up, how to be able to make the most of the assets the company has, how to look for where there are gaps. And what we see at the moment is, especially in professional services, we see a lot of acquisitions happening to build that capability, to be able to deliver. Even in consumer goods companies, you see a lot of acquisitions happening to build a brand or capability as well. So I think it is the dot joining that's going to be needed from the personal perspective. In the finance and corporate world as well, there's a lot happening around data and digital, and they're big enablers of understanding risk. They're big enablers of being able to mobilize new ways of doing things. And so I do think there's a strong technical and data angle in terms of capabilities, as well, organizational capabilities. But also being able to understand what that data is telling, to be able to make the right business decisions as well. And that sort of data is not just what your LCA or your carbon footprint is, right? That is about how you can access the right market or assess which products are going to do well, and so on and so forth. So I think that those things, I think, are going to be critical going forward. The other aspect is those who can engage with external stakeholders, external companies, to be able to be the market makers and make sure they're keeping the organizations held to account. So make sure there's not the greenwashing happening as well. So there's that sense of remaining a good business and not jumping ahead of yourself as well.
Yeah. And there's a quote, I'm going to probably misquote, but there's something like there were two gentlemen in a small town outside of Dublin, and one said to the other, how do you get to Dublin from here? And the other one says, if you want to go to Dublin, I wouldn't start from here. And my point is, some companies, that kind of transformation from where they are today to where they could be in a more enlightened world is almost so massive that it's existential in terms of what they trade in and what they do. Obviously, all companies are different and we have a range of firms represented on the audience today. But what's your, I suppose, for some of those maybe more difficult, let's say mining, let's pick on that one as an example. How they're making big efforts because clearly they have investors like BlackRock who have metrics they want to see improvement upon. But what's been your sort of take on how they will be able to apply these sort of metrics to their performance?
Yeah, and I guess each industry has its own path in many cases, and a lot of the regulation or the data standards, if you like, are not necessarily there to move one company or one organization. They're there to move the industry, or they're there to move the system. And so I think it can be difficult when you're perhaps don't feel like you're starting in the right place, right? Or it's an uphill battle to be able to deliver on the expectations around ESG. It's a journey, and everybody will be talking about the transition, and in particular around climate and heavy industry. There is a transition that will be needed. And so for many of those organizations, it's about understanding not just what they can do within their organization, but how do they move the industry? How do they move the ecosystem where they are? How can they perhaps even sort of ensure that there's the right financing mechanisms, or the right engagement with governments, even to be able to have a scale play, or to be able to make an impact. If you're sitting there and not knowing what to do, then it's time to kind of to reach out more. So I think that it's a hard place, but there are organisations who've just re-looked at their business models as well, as a utility provider, getting into different services, DSM changing their whole portfolio and way of thinking about things. These take time for the asset heavy companies, perhaps a bit more so. But it is about getting your roadmap through that transition and making sure that you're not doing it alone.
Yeah. You spoke about data and understanding, currently what resources are being used at the moment, and how to benchmark improvements and level up, or just drag an industry up a little bit. We've spoken before about this notion of translators, which again is quite common in some of the sort of more data heavy jobs and roles that we work in at Fresh Minds. But people who are taking quite big concepts and then delivering them at a kind of program or project level within companies. Do you see there could be this is not me hawking for business, but is there a role for people, program managers, project managers, to then actually help to deliver the sorts of thinking that people like you will help advise companies to do?
Yeah, and in many cases, I think there's some really strong technical competencies in ESG and sustainability, and they're hugely valuable. Whether you're looking at something like capability to do LCAs, life cycle assessments in products, or whether you have a deep technical understanding of, say,
so what's an LCA?
A life cycle assessment of a product.
Apologies.
So full life. Or if it's a technical space around climate policy, or whether it's a technical space around, if we're talking about analytics, right? Some of the big data approaches to ESG at the moment. It's all well and good having these technical approaches, but it does require, as you say, the translators, the business partners, to be able to look at how do we utilize this? How do we make the most of this information, data, or capabilities? So that's a bit of the dot joiners, I guess, across companies as well, to be able to take that evidence-based, fact-based, if you like, tooling, and be able to make it meaningful for shaping the business decision well. But I do think the data aspect is a critical one around the translator aspect as well.
Yeah. And also it's complex, it's literally, as you said, across every area of the business in terms of its delivery or ambition, I suppose. So from corporates, I thought we might just really focus a little bit on the consulting industry. It's obviously an area that Fresh Minds works a huge amount in supplying people on a permanent and interim basis. But one thing I've certainly found is, I suppose, it's fairly new, but you can sort of see the suits are getting interested in ESG. And what I mean by that is, I can see a lot of consulting firms quickly building understanding, capability, and expertise. and to help advise corporates on how they can improve their performance in this sort of area. What are you sort of seeing out there in terms of the sort of trends that we might expect to see in the UK in the coming years?
Coming years. At the moment, I think, it's a good question. I've spent the last 6 months, if you like, reacquainting myself with the rest of the industry, and it's really exciting. There's not just within the consulting market in particular, but that is. I don't think I know any sustainability or ESG consulting organization that's not hiring at the moment or buying at the moment, right? It's really alive. And so there is a war on talent for the consulting space to do the best consulting. I think there's also a war on talent around heads of ESGs within corporates in particular, finance sector in particular as well. And that sense of what are you getting when you hire somebody in something? I think it's really dynamic. I think here to stay. I don't think it's going to be dying off anytime soon, and that's where you see the investments in bigger teams. I think there's some risk of organisations just putting somebody in with a head of ESG role and not really thinking about that person is there to help the organisation change, not just to tick boxes. And so I think those people in those sorts of roles are ready to roll up their sleeves and help the organisation make better choices, make better investment decisions, get value from their ESG approaches as well. I think that's a critical aspect around making sure that if you're hiring in those sorts of areas, that there's the opportunity to create change within the organisation, not just tick the boxes, create a nice report, or think about how you might share your data in a different format to be able to respond to a stakeholder or a shareholder request. So I think that's a key part of that war on talent that I think that's really important. And
you think it sounds like you're on the kind of on the investment category, I suppose, of ESG. Again, you think that feels like it's here to stay?
Yeah, I do. I think it's here to stay because it's going to need to be. Organizations can think about these roles as license to operate. That's kind of an old school way, but there's plenty of organizations that need to get on the first rungs of building this in. I think it's here to stay because those companies will realize that it's an opportunity to grow, or it's an opportunity to change, or it's an opportunity to reach a new market. And so they will move along that journey as well. And if they don't, I think they're going to be caught out and left behind, not just by regulation catching up to them perhaps, but also because the market will move on. Whether it's being more savvy about new technologies, new digital, new biological, other technologies, and how that delivers through to how consumers are making different decisions around what products they purchase, and needing to be relevant within those circles as well. I think those roles are here to stay, and those roles will evolve and develop. We spoke a little bit about the digital and innovation analogy, if you like, as well. That is sustainability, or ESG, the new digital. It all evolves, right? Everybody in my role, or who's had my type of role, will have said that we were hoping to do ourselves out of a job, right? We're saying that 15 years ago. I don't see us being out of a job anytime soon, but I see those jobs changing and becoming more integrated, similar to digital. Those jobs had to be there to raise the flag and to get it moving, but they're now becoming much more integrated. Likewise with innovation, I think it's a similar space and a similar journey, perhaps. There
used to be kind of, I suppose we always used to sort of have analog clients and digital clients. I think, well, particularly what happened in the last year, everyone's been fast forwarded 10 years to become much more digital, and it's now part of the the rhythm of life. I think also from a talent perspective, I think, looking at the people in our network, they want to work as consumers and as employees for companies that care and do things about improving diversity or improving the environment or behaving to a certain code of conduct to each other and to as shareholders. So yeah, there's definitely a broader groundswell on that. But with any groundswell, there's always a potential for a little bit of greenwash or a bit of hype in an area. And I think you and I were discussing our gluten-free toothpaste the other day, vegan toothpaste, which I think has been vegan for many years, but is now branded as such. I suppose, yeah, not being too cynical, but I suppose there is a risk that brands, and I know you work with the World Economic Forum on the consumer brands as a big part of your role at Accenture, on them using whether it's diversity or ESG as a kind of marketing tool, which is a good signal, but is it actually driving the fundamental change that we need because there is obviously a tension between consumption, which is what companies want people to do, and trying to limit resources in terms of a better approach to sustainability. So just interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, yes. I think that there's a lot of hype. I think that there's a lot of greenwashing. There's also a lot of risk of the greenwashing actually diminishing the impact when actually there's big changes happening as well. I don't mind a bit of hype actually, because it creates the groundswell, it creates the sort of the forces that need to keep things going. So I'm not too worried about the hype so much, although I think we'll see some dips and things over the coming year as organizations settle with, are they going to make changes or not that are fundamentally going to be game changing from an impact standpoint, versus it's a flash in the pan and we just need to brand it green, right, to be able to get across the line. I think that will come out in the wash, if you like. But there is a lot of purpose washing, there is a lot of greenwashing. A gluten-free toothpaste, or actually as a consumer, and right, I'm an informed consumer, as are many people. It's just as hard for me to make a decision at the supermarket, right, compared with anybody else. And I think that there is a lot that will happen around standards, or perhaps even it's peer keeping each other to account a little bit in not going overboard with the greenwashing, not going overboard with the marketing, and hopefully it does end up creating a better portfolio or a set of choices, or actually you're taking out the option to have the poor choices, which will actually move society on as well. Yeah.
Yes, I went around a rabbit warren or confusion around Oatly's marketing. I think they're private equity backed versus grass-fed Welsh dairy, and I probably came out more confused after going down the rabbit hole than I was when I started. But I suppose it probably comes back to data and information, doesn't it? But this is a contested and complex sort of world for consumers.
Totally, and there's one thing with how brands choose to market their product to be able to hit your heartstrings, if you like, or in our cases maybe hit our head strings. I don't know what it is, but there's also a sense of understanding your consumer values and being able to respond to them is a big part of that marketing story and journey. It's also where we as consumers need to understand what our values are with products. If you're buying something for its nutritional value, or are you buying something for its carbon footprint, or are you buying something because everybody else is, or is it because it foams well when you're making a coffee, whatever it might be, right? There's some different aspects to what we consider is good, and the companies and brands need to think about all of these aspects, right? And I don't mind too much having more of these on the market, but it's not easy for consumers to make the choices. What you will find, I guess, is, or what we hope to find is, I guess, simpler information for us to be able to make those decisions, or better informed consumers can therefore make a better point of purchase decision as well.
Great. And is there a sort of a 101 book you'd recommend on sort of metrics and what one should look at in terms of ESG?
Gosh, no, I can come back. I'll come back to you on that one, James.
Maybe that's a book for you to write in your next lockdown, maybe.
Yeah, well, next one, it's probably not far away. No, I think I've been asked a few times around how do you get upskilled in this sort of area as well, and there's just a lot of happening. I think it's reading around, keeping abreast, but always having a critical eye on every article that comes back as well. Whether it's the sort of the recent Netflix Seaspiracy or whatever, or whether you're actually looking to go to Cambridge and do the Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership course or another, right? There's always this aspect of continuing to be critical, continuing to ask questions. But I don't think there's a single document or a single book that I'd necessarily recommend at this point, but happy to come back with a reading list. Great.
Well, I might have to tap you up for that. Brilliant. Well, listen, I think we now just to our audience, yeah, please feel free to add a question to the Q&A or the chat. I will try to get through them and chair questions as appropriately. We have one that has come through already. Let me just ping that open. And this is from Caro. Hello. And it's investors like BlackRock, who I think were probably quite an early mover in the ESG world, have increased the onus on companies through their latest engagement priorities. What's your view on the impact this has on operating models, costs, and enablers of success for companies going forward?
Good question, massive question. And I think I've touched a little bit on it. In many cases, I think there's a big look in terms of just operating models, I guess, with business models and how to do things differently, how to take a different view in terms of how you think about value of business, and being able to do full cost accounting, I guess, around sustainability and other aspects. I think that's a big part of it. I think the onus as well means that you're thinking about around some different time horizons, and also thinking about where your place is in the industry. Are you going to be doing your best in a dirty industry, for example, and trying to help everybody push forward and be part of the transition with a decarbonisation approach, I guess? Or are you looking to really fundamentally change what you do? I think there's a little bit of both of those things happening when companies need to really take those pressures on board as well. I think the key thing is to be honest with it as well, right? Of where you sit within that mix.
Yes, and you said a lot. It's a journey for a lot of companies.
Yeah, it's a journey, but it's not a journey you do alone.
Yeah.
I think is important, right?
By industry.
Know who your partners are, know who the other industry players are, know where you sit and make the right decisions, whether you're going to innovate yourself out of it or whether you're going to do incremental changes and sort of bring the bottom of the industry up.
Yeah, and do you think that might drive a world of a few more partnerships, whereby you might see the big competitors actually on some areas of business looking at how they can work in a more sustainable future together more?
I hope so, and I think we see a lot more happening around ecosystems, and ecosystems are going to mean more partnerships, whether that's JVs or others, or whether that's partnering, or whether that's just agreeing on standards or protocols. I think, yes, it doesn't always need to be that you're going hand in hand, but agreeing on more things together, I think, yes. That said, if you're innovating yourself out of this, right, you're being really competitive about thinking about what the market opportunities are here as well. And in that case, it's less about innovating with your peers, right, and it's more about thinking about a new way of doing things. So I think there's a bit of both happening at the moment, depending on the industry that you're working in.
Great. Now, I've got a couple of questions on the jobs market. So I might just bunch this one together. So first one from James. So James, how do you see ESG impacting the labour market, namely the choices and thinking that candidates will now start making? And another question from Maria. Hello, Maria, is what advice would you give to professionals who want to enter the ESG world? So what transferable skills or types of industries do you think would attract people who do well in that, be it in a corporate ESG role, maybe in an advisory role within a consulting firm, let's say?
Good questions. And I've chatted with quite a few people on this in this space recently, actually, and because there's a huge amount of graduates, if you like, who are looking for a role in ESG or sustainability, or are driven by companies who have a really strong purpose. So it's a bit of a twofold there in terms of the job market. I think ESG and sustainability means that companies are going to have to be upfront and more transparent on what they're doing and how they're doing it. And so for the job market, for those entering the job market in this sort of space, is having these extra aspects to weigh up. That's a massive part of the employee value proposition, especially for more junior folk. I guess the other pace with making those decisions is, and I've spoken to a lot of people trying to get into ESG and sustainability consulting as out of university, for example, and I think that's tough, right? Because there's a certain amount of industry experience, functional experience, I think, that is really heavily useful for having a role in sustainability and ESG. I'm not one of those, actually, but I do think having really strong industry knowledge or having really strong market knowledge, commodities knowledge, or whatever it might be, actually gives you a really good footing in this sort of space. And so entering the market is about using all of your strengths and capabilities to be able to think about what does that mean for ESG, or what does that mean for sustainability within this sector. It's those who know the industries really well, or the art of the possible, that can actually start to apply ESG and sustainability principles. So there's not enough roles to go around for everybody wanting to play in this, I guess. So it is about bringing the other transferable skills, I think, into this. And in many cases, people who have these sorts of skills can actually work faster, perhaps, with the industry transformation space. If we're looking at the energy industry, for example, that's going through a massive transformation, almost a 180-degree sort of shift, and so it's the whole industry that's having to change and shift, and so it's those industry skills that are important. In consumer industries, I've been talking about, it's brand by brand, it's consumer by consumer almost, it's market by market, and so there's a lot of different things happening at multi-speed, if you like. And that's where there's a different set of skills needed around sustainability and ESG to be able to help the organizations manage those sorts of journeys. So I think my recommendation is think about how it applies to what you know already, and where you can apply your current thinking to the problem and sort of jump in there.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And I think, you see there are a lot of quite small ESG consultancies appearing, with probably led by quite strong experts, but quite small firms, so you'll learn quite a lot. And then you're seeing the bigger, traditional consulting firms launching a practice and building out from there. And then obviously there's all the corporates who might be hiring into the area. But looking at the jobs on the LinkedIn today, a lot of them were within the investment world. So it's like ESG analysts looking at the performance of companies.
Yeah, and I think it's good for people to cut their teeth on some of that work as well, right? Because that's where you get the breadth of experience in these sorts of analyst type roles. And if somebody's smart and always being inquisitive about things, then I think there's a huge amount to learn from those sorts of roles as well. I guess what I'm also seeing from the consulting side of things is the opportunity that having, I don't know, an innovation background perhaps also opens up a lot of the opportunities as well, because it is about bigger thinking, or it is about a game change, it is about a new business model. So a lot of the thinking at that sort of level is required to create the ESG and the sustainability transformation that we need within organizations. Whereas I think many of the investment companies perhaps are looking for this ability to bring together the ESG data, information and insight alongside the financial aspects. And so that requires good analytical thinking. That also requires the ability to read between the lines. Companies don't put everything on a website, right? So it does require that ability to ask the tricky questions to be able to get to the bottom of, actually, is this a risk or an opportunity?
Yeah. And we want to look at an individual company level, or I suppose at a larger government level. And Ian, who's one of our favorite webinar guests, he's just asked a couple of, and he used to be I think he was head of transformation at Royal Mail, his previous life, but he's just said, what was the role of government and regulators in promoting ESG? And then really following on from that, what does good look like, and what are the benchmark organizations that we should maybe look up to?
Yeah. Firstly, role of government regulation. It's almost behind, right? So the government and regulation, I think, is sort of pulling the bottom up. In many cases, it's not really, has not really been there to sort of help the innovative front edge. So I think the government has a role with being able to do that. I think it also has a massive role, particularly perhaps with climate and with COP coming up as well. It has a massive role to create the enabling environment, not just for standards and sort of leveling the playing field, but it has a massive role now in being able to create the market mechanisms to be able to for companies to be able to fast track or scale some of their initiatives, or to be able to work better together. So I think it's bigger than I once thought, right? In terms of what their role is. I'm not sure I'm necessarily. I'm always an optimist. So I'm expecting that we'll be able to see some good news by the end of the year as well. But I think the regulations and government do have a role as well in thinking about I don't know, the refocusing the market, that this is what good looks like as well. So linking those two questions together almost. It's around that little and often, it's that communication that this is what good looks like, and moving in this direction. So I hope that the sort of the foot doesn't come off the accelerator after COP as well, that there is increasingly this opportunity for innovation through government angles and avenues as well. And good, what does good look like? It's a really good question today, and I've as ever, there's always been a discussion around who are the best purpose-led companies and things like that, who are really changing their business models and thinking about this, whether it's the often mentioned Patagonia or Unilever perhaps, or organizations like DSM who decide to change very much their business model and focus. I think that obviously the markets have done some interesting stuff over the last couple of days with Tesla's commentary around around Bitcoin and things like that, right? And whereas Tesla's sort of pushing the market opportunities, there's some other market mechanisms at play. So I think there's sort of not one company I think is necessarily the leader. I think there's lots doing interesting things at the moment. In the UK, you see lots of innovative business models, lots of big commitment, like, for example, I don't know, Brewdog using bread for brewing, for example, to reduce sort of the, or having a circular economy approach to what they're doing. But you also see a lot of big commitments around zero carbon or even carbon positive, for example. So there's some of those sorts of aspects are interesting to think about as well when we think about what good looks like. I think everybody's on their own journey, and so it is a bit about big commitments, but back up those big commitments with real action as well.
And this may be answered you may have answered the question I'm about to ask you with what you've just said, but I suppose that Luke's question was really around, like, in your experience of looking at companies which obviously range from consumer goods to more heavy industry, let's say, where do you feel organizations struggle most in their ESG journey? So is it like getting started? Is it then like about implementing the changes, understanding the impact, or elsewhere?
I think many probably are okay with setting a strategy, because there's a certain set of, I guess, principles around how high does your target need to be. Some are struggling a bit more of, is it just targets and doing more of the same but in a different way, or is it about changing their business model? Those are going through a bit of a different journey. The execution is massive problem. So I think the implementation piece is tough. And I think you mentioned that the other part of Luke's question was around measuring. I think there's a huge amount of reliance on, if you don't measure it, you don't manage it. If you don't do that, you don't know your improvement and ability to make decisions. But I think the execution aspect is the biggest area of challenge, and that's because you're dealing with existing culture change within the organization. You're having to overhaul processes and the rules of the game that the company might have had. You're having to do business in a different way. And so a lot of the implementing and the execution changes, I think, are also people and human changes as well that need to happen. So I think that's the biggest area of challenge as well.
Great. Got a question from Catherine here. Are there any regulations designed to prevent greenwashing for all sectors and corporates in the UK and Europe?
Well, I guess the sustainable finance taxonomy in the EU, the ESG disclosure areas are designed predominantly for that in particular. I'm not an expert in the regulatory aspects here, but certainly that's set up to reduce the risk of greenwashing and to standardize, if you like, a little bit of the aspects there. The European Green Deal set of policy initiatives to be able to help Europe become climate neutral. Now, these are EU, right, not UK. So there's a little bit of the UK's decided to do their own thing there. So I'm not absolutely up to speed with the UK. The task force on climate-related financial disclosure is another big one. So there are a couple of big ones that are doing that, but I'm not sure necessarily that they are stopping the greenwashing that's necessarily happening around the overstating of commitments, the greenwashing perhaps that happens with particular brand stories and products. So I think that's sort of yet to come. So there's a big responsibility still on consumers, on activist organizations, and on all of us to hold to account, as well as the regulatory frameworks.
Great. And I've had another question just on from someone who works for a startup, and she just said, we don't really have much of an ESG agenda per se as a small startup. Where could we begin?
Interesting. I was on a call this morning actually with someone who provides training for startups in particular, and support as they go through funding rounds, to talk a little bit about this particular piece. And there's a little bit of two sides to this, I think. One is that you're seeing a lot of startups are actually developing with a business purpose that is to solve a sustainability challenge, or to support a greener economy, or to support, I don't know, consumers making better choices, or to support circularity in goods. So there's a lot of startups that have actually got this in mind, and I think that there's that sense of a lot of purpose within what they're doing. When it's a startup or a small enterprise that hasn't got that as their sort of their end goal, it ends up being, how do we do as best as we can with what we have at the moment while still starting up? And I've seen that a lot with over COVID, for example, a lot of the small food businesses having to struggle with, yes, we're going to delivery, but we're going to deliver in all plastic containers. How do we think about the incremental things we need to do?
Yeah.
For any organization, you typically understand your sustainability actions that you need to address through two things. One is engage with the stakeholders, understand what's important to them. And secondly, good old materiality assessment, which is basically looking at what are the biggest issues that are relevant for you, both from an impact standpoint as well as from an opportunity standpoint. So I think those two things, if you've got those, then you can make the right decisions.
Brilliant, great. And I'm not sure you love this question. I think I might have asked it before, but I went to a slightly heated hydrogen versus electric webinar last year, at the end of last year, and this came up, but it's been asked again here. So the question ultimately, I suppose, is the kind of, I suppose, is Elon Musk is the problem here, whereby he's created this whole EV market, but actually maybe the who is primarily responsible for how will they ensure that we don't overbalance the transition in certain industries to create new problems? So, for example, batteries, Chinese companies using cobalt extracted from the DRC or from the People's Republic of Congo, which supports the transition away from fossil fuels, but still encourages unethical practices in those mines, whereas other companies in Europe are looking at recycled minerals and materials. How do we ensure that the global transition to solve one problem does not just create other ones?
I don't know. No, hands up here. So I guess there's what I do like is a bit of the mix, and we need to be really careful about the unintended consequences of big decisions, especially when they are so far-reaching, whether that's industry-wide or whatever. But what I do think is appropriate is we need to be able to push innovative solutions. There needs to be the space to be able to try some of these sorts of new models. There's a way to do that, I guess, and there's a way not to do that, and being able to be quick to understand or recognize the trade-offs or the unintended consequences, or when actually you've made a mistake. So we're having to move really quickly because it is a crisis period. We have to move really quickly in being able to identify those organizations who can be really dynamic and do something game-changing and different, and just leapfrog, if you like. But totally get that we also need those who are sort of taking the slightly slower approach, more calculated approach to all of the benefits and the other aspects as well. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah. I think we need a mix, and I think we just need to be always cognizant of the unintended consequences and have the honest conversation.
Yeah. And do you think, if you look at, like, I suppose, diesel in Europe or NOx, and the kind of bet that was made there, 30, 40 years ago, I guess. You know, without fast forward, do you think we'll have a few more choices than just electric? Will be hydrogen cars? Do you think there'll be a bit of a mix out there and the kind of things that government support?
Oh gosh, I'm not an expert in mobility at all in this space. Certainly, you've seen a lot of hydrogen vehicles in terms of heavy goods movement and freight and things like that. I expect everything will be on the table, right? But some countries, some markets are going to be better suited to be able to deal with that as well. There's also the consumer mindset. There's the infrastructure that's needed to be able to move some of these things as well. I'm really conscious, I guess, that it's a number of these things need to play out at a market level to be successful, and they won't be successful in all markets in all the same way. But on the EV, hydrogen, diesel space, I really don't know the answer there.
And quick, so just a bit of bit of free information for you, for our guests. Enjoying the conversation. For those interested in social impact benchmarks, check out 60 decibels. I haven't actually checked the website. I assume it's appropriate. And please have a little look at that. And from benchmarks, just I suppose, yeah, we're coming to the end of our session. Finish up in 3 or 4 minutes time. But Jamie has asked about sort of considering cost accounting and sustainability. What role might EP&L play in unifying stakeholders and shareholders around a common framework and language?
Good question. And I guess whether it's Puma or Caring and others have sort of kicked off this space in the past. I think it provides a good framework for integrating. I think that there's a huge amount of focus on the E part, and there has been, and there needs to be, obviously. I'd like to make sure that we're considering the other aspects of impact within that as well. But yes, a big part of being able to integrate it in how you think about full cost accounting. Yeah, I'm not sure how much it helps to address the innovation angle that's often needed directly.
Thank you very much indeed. I think we've just got a couple of minutes left. So yeah. So I suppose looking to the future, you know, got COP26 in the first couple of weeks of November up in Glasgow. You know, what is next, I suppose? Where do you see, I don't want to be too general in my question, but where do you see things going? Do you see some sort of new global frameworks? Do you see consumers getting much more on board? What are the sort of themes that we should, just in terms of our jobs and looking like we know a bit more than we really do? What would be your sort of things we can take away?
I don't think COP is going to stop things, right? It's not up till November, and that will then kick off a whole range of new ways of having to think about working. So that needs to be here to stay. We're not working up to COP, right? We're actually, COP is the milestone at which then things can accelerate from, I hope. So I think that's here to, that's not just here to stay, that's here to change, if you like, and evolve. I think there's so much happening around frameworks and standards and regulations across the ESG space more broadly. I think there's likely to be some, not necessarily some consolidation, but perhaps clarity at some points. But likewise, I think it will evolve, and each industry will be on its own journey. Each organization needs to think about the full spectrum of opportunities here. In particular, I don't think it's sort of a flash in the pan. I don't think it's anything will stop, but I think we need to always think about it. So a little bit like innovation, or a little bit like digital. It'll keep changing. In 6 months' time, we'll be having a slightly progressed conversation. I just hope we can be talking about more, I guess, disruptive scale opportunities, rather than all of this individual company moving at their own pace. Because when we do things together, we can actually shift a lot more. So I hope that there's a lot more of that level thinking and partnerships. And I hope that the consumers keep and citizens keep holding us all to account on this as well.
Brilliant. Yes. Senior buy-in from the top, consumer pressure, an optimistic note to end your talk, Melissa. Thank you so much. Really fascinating, from the history and emergence of ESG through to its application in business, be it corporate consulting, and then loads of useful stuff on skills and capabilities. Yeah, I think we've all learned a little bit more than we did an hour ago. So thank you so much for your time. I hope our audience will enjoyed yourselves. We will be having our next webinar in the next few weeks, probably around, it hasn't been confirmed, it's probably going to be around the return to the office or hybrid working of sorts. A lot of our clients are interested in that, and we might pull together a few people who know better than I, and we can find out what they're thinking, what's going to be happening. So just from Melissa and I to thank you all so much for turning up and listening in on a rainy and actually now sunny day. That's the impact of Melissa. So have a lovely afternoon. Take care. See you soon.
Thanks.